All right, welcome to our second lecture in the Sports Betting 101 series. And today we're going to talk about how lines are made. And this is going to be really important because once you start to understand how lines are actually made, you'll start to understand why some of these conspiracy theories and things you see on social media just don't make any sense. And also what you can do to help win yourself more bets by just simply changing the time that you bet. So, in this lesson, we're going to learn why the Vegas is always right is just absolutely the biggest myth, the two different types of sports books that exist out there and why they're so important. And spoiler, a lot of people don't know this. Again, we'll talk about how lines are made and what you can do to help you win more. So let's kind of kick this off. Tell me if you heard this scenario before. Maybe you've lived it yourself, right? You see on social media, you hear this tweet or someone's talking about so and so book is, oh, we've got all this action on one team, the book needs this other team to win. Vegas needs such and such team to win tonight. Oh, here we go. The fix is in, right? Here's a screenshot looking at this Bills Ravens game. All Bills plus 2.5 all week. We're going to need Baltimore to win by a field goal to crown the day. This is coming from Bucket Baldini's sports book here. And so, what about when a game's really close, right? You see these posts come up, say, "Hey, look, all this money we're on, one team to cover." In this case, it was Cowboys -5.5. They missed this field goal at the end of regulation. Cowboys going to win by 5. And seemingly, again, Vegas got it right. Everyone lost their money because the Giants covered because of a questionable missed field goal. Well, the reality is that's just not true. Okay. First and foremost, let's kind of talk about what's happening here. So, Vegas isn't just one entity. When we talk about Vegas and sports betting, it's not like it's just one company or one entity that has all these bets. There are a bunch of different independent individual sports books with their own handle, or as we see here, it handles just the total amount of money wagered on any particular game or event. So all of these different sports books have their own handle. They all have their own individual needs. They have their own individual, splits of how much money is on one team or what outcome, etc. And so what you're looking at here is just a list of just in Nevada alone, the different sports books that exist. And this doesn't even look at things like, FanDuel and DraftKings, etc. So at any given point, any one of these sports books, yeah, one of them may have a heavy lopsided handle on one team, but it doesn't mean that they all have that same sort of liability and certainly not at that same number. So again, this idea that once one book needs something, they all need it, that's just not true. And then let's kind of look at the other angle, right? Like Vegas always gets it right. And again, maybe you've lived this. Maybe it's been a time where you've had a bet or you've known someone who's had a bet where the outcome, the final score was like a point off from what the spread was. And you think, oh, see, Vegas, they just know. They know from the get-go. So let's look at the Super Bowl 59, right? Last year's Super Bowl, you can see a screenshot here from Legal Sports Report looking at the handle. And FanDuel had its busiest day. They had 16.6 million bets on Super Bowl Sunday, while DraftKings also had, a record day. They had about 12 million bets. But just look at that alone, right? That's over 4.5 million more bets at FanDuel than DraftKings. So this idea that one, all sports books have this equal liability and equal amount of money and splits is just not true. But then two, again, looking at these things always come out the way Vegas, quote unquote, predicts. Look at this. The Eagles were 1 to 1.5 point dogs, depending on what book you bet them at, right? And again, going back to this idea that these books don't have the same exact liability, same exact handle. And of course, the Eagles went out and blew the Chiefs out, ended up winning by 18 in a game that really wasn't even this close, right? So Vegas doesn't always get it right, but once you understand how these lines work, you understand exactly what's going on here and how you can use this to your advantage. Okay. So before we can talk about any of the stuff, we have to set the record straight from the very, very beginning. And that means we have to talk about the two different types of sports books. So there are market makers and retail. Now, if you're watching this, you probably have only dealt with the retail. You probably don't even know the ones on the left even exist, but they are incredibly important in how they shape the lines that you see on the apps that you pull up. Okay. So market makers are like BetCris, Pinnacle. These are offshore books, and Circus Sports, based in Nevada, Las Vegas. they're trying to become the market maker for collegiate sports. And they're having some success there. And then the retail books are the ones you're probably most familiar with. Just to name a few: ESPN Bet, Caesars, FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, etc. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, what you have to understand is whenever you see a line open up for a book, the majority of the time it's coming from a market maker. And just like the name suggests, it's the type of sports book that makes the market, right? They're the ones who set the opening line. Now, if you're new to betting or you've been betting for a while and you haven't really done much work into figuring out the background of these lines, you're probably only used to what we call the closing line. And the closing line is the line that you see that happens or that exists right before kickoff or tip off. So if you're betting NFL football, then the closing line be the line that you see, right on Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon, depending on what coast side of the coast you are. That is, let's say Bears -3, and they're about to kick off in 2 minutes, right? That's the closing line, the last line that was available before the event started. Well, that line they didn't just make up that line. They just come up with that number. It actually starts with the opening line. And what happens with the opening line at these market maker books is they undergo what's called price discovery. And this is so incredibly important to understand if you're ever going to make sports bets. So what happens is these market makers, they set a line and they let this line move based off the action of sharp bettors. So when sharp bettors come in and they feed in their information, they feed in their thoughts via them putting money down to bet on a game, the market maker says, "Ooh, okay, I'm getting money over here. Maybe I should move that line." Or, "Oh, I'm getting money over there." So that happens back and forth all week for, let's use football as an example, until you get to the closing line right when kickoff happens. So let's use kind of an example that make a little more sense. Let's say we have this game between Ohio State and Central Michigan in college football, right? So an extreme example would be we have the line opens at Ohio State -1. So this market maker says, "Hey, okay, I know nothing about football. I have these two teams going up against each other. Let's just set a line at Ohio State -1." So they set that line and they open it up for people to bet at their market maker book. Again, this is different from the retail apps and whatnot. So someone comes in and they say, yeah, obviously Ohio State is going to beat Central Michigan by more than 1 point. Give me Ohio State, please." The market maker book says, "Okay, I will take your bet, and then I will move the line to Ohio State -2." Somebody else comes along, says, "Ohio State -2. Yes, absolutely. Please give me that for as much as I can." The market maker says, "All right, I'll take their bet, and I'm going to move it to -3 now," right? And this process just keeps going on and on and on again until, let's say, hypothetically, this gets to Ohio State -38. Well, then now someone comes and says, "Well, Central Michigan plus 38, that's just way too many points. Give me Central Michigan, please," right? And so what happens here is that you have all these sharp bettors who come in and saying, "Okay, this line is too good. I'm going to put my money here," until it gets to the point where other sharp bettors say, "Well, based on how I calculate this, that's too many points. Give me the other team." And this action just kind of goes back and forth. It's a marketplace. It's just buying and selling back and forth until you get to a point where there's not a lot of lopsided money or bets on either side. Now, it's never going to be a perfect 50-50, but you're going to get to the point where you're not getting people just unilaterally slamming one side and not buying the other. And that's where the closing line ends up, right? When you start getting a lack of dominance from sharp bettors on one side or the other, that's where the lines start to get stable. Now, in a real world, though, these market maker books are not that dumb. They're not going to give you a Ohio State -1 against a Central Michigan, right? So what they do is they set this opening line. They're not trying to outsmart anybody else. They're not, they don't know anything more than all these other bettors do. What they're going to do is take kind of what they call like a power rating. So kind of like what you may see on ESPN, something like that, where you have this rating system and you're using it to kind of make up a number of roughly how good a team is. So in that Ohio State example, it won't open up at -1. Maybe it opens up at -21.5, right? Just making up a number here, right? But it's going to be something that's a little bit close to reality. Now, you may be thinking, well, hold on. Even if they still open up at minus 21 and a half and the true line's 38, well, what about all those bettors who got in real good? I should be like them, right? I just want to bet at these market maker books because I can pick off all these lines and make a ton of money. Well, they know this too, right? The market makers understand this. And so what they're going to do is say, okay, when these lines first open, they know that they're going to move. So what they do is they put fairly low limits. And I say fairly low, these don't look really large for us regular folk, but in the world of professional sports betting, it is, fairly low. And so what happens is they know that some of these sharp bettors are going to get the best of them. So they try to limit how much they can make. And so what you're seeing here is a screenshot from Circus Sports in Las Vegas, and it's looking at their NFL and college football limits. So let's look at college football at the bottom there. You can see on Sunday morning, and remember, these are opening lines. So if this is happening on Saturday, we're talking about the Sunday before. That's how long these lines are out there. So Sunday at 11 a.m., these lines get released, and you can see here the opening limit for sides, i.e., spreads, is $3,000. And then as the afternoon goes on, it goes up to 5K. And then throughout the week, you can see it goes up and up and up, all the way to $100,000 on the day of the game, right? And so what they're doing is they're saying, all right, well, we know people are going to bet immediately if we're off, but we're only going to limit them to $3,000 at a time they can take us for, knowing that by Saturday, they're going to have hundreds of thousands of dollars coming in, per bet, or maybe $100,000 per bet come in on Saturday. And the number Saturday is going to be far more sharp, right? So the take home point here is that these lines are low early while these sharp bettors are, betting them, trying to get their money in, and therefore hammering them or making them more sharp. And then as time goes on, the lines increase, the limits increase. And so when people who are really trying to make money come in, it's a lot harder to pick off a bad line because they've already been gone through. And then the other thing that market makers do is they profile their bettors. They know who's sharp and who's not, right? And so again, I give an example. Let's say we have, Ohio State versus Central Michigan comes in, and we have, Billy Walters, certified legend of sports betting, come in and say, oh, Ohio State minus 28, that's way too easy. Give me Ohio State, please. And then you have, let's say, Dave Portnoy, who doesn't sports bet for a living. He's just rich. He has a lot of money, and he's willing to throw that money around. And he says, no, Central Michigan, yeah, no, that's give me plus 28, right? Well, in my example earlier, we had money come in on one side, which should move the line towards Ohio State. And then I have money on the other side that should move the money or move the line back to Central Michigan. Well, not really, right? These market maker books, they know who the sharp person is. They're going to listen to the sharp person, and they're pretty much going to ignore these recreational amateur bettors because they know that they don't really have an edge. They're just have money to blow. And so knowing who the sharp bettors are and what they're betting on is how these market maker books know how and when to move the line. And the biggest difference at the market makers books is that they allow sharp bettors to bet there and they don't limit them. Now, when I say limit them, I mean that they don't say, hey, you, John Doe, you specifically can only bet X amount of dollars. The limits, like what you see here on the screenshot, apply to any and everyone. All people are welcome. All comers are they'll take all action. They won't single out any one person is the best way to put that. And because they know who these sharp bettors are, because they know how they're betting, they're using that to make these lines very sharp, i.e., make them hard to beat for the general public. Well, that's their secret sauce. They don't release that betting data out to anybody else. So the only betting data that you get from market makers is what is the line and currently, and what did it come from, and what their odds are. But they don't tell you John Doe bet this side, Jane Doe bet that side. John Doe's a 5-star super mega sharp. He's really good at sides and totals and player props. No, no, no. You get none of that. And I'm going to bring this back up later into why it's so important when you hear a lot of noise on social media that just doesn't make any sense. Okay, now let's look at a real life example, right? So if you look here, this is Clemson versus Texas, and this line opened up at Texas minus 8.5, and it got all the way up to minus 14 before it got bought back down to Texas minus 13.5, right? And so if you just kind of look here, right, start from bottom up, you can see here, I had to scroll a little bit where so this got from minus 8.5 to minus 11.5 on 12/14, and then at 12/21 that morning got bought back down at 13.5, but at 12:20 at 9:16, it was up as high as minus 14. So why is that important? Well, Texas went on to win that game by 14 points, right? So you hear people say, oh man, the line was 13 and a half. Well, that was the closing line, right? And so, yeah, it was real. The actual outcome of the game was really close to what the line was. But if you had bet Texas a day before, or let me say, let me flip it around. If you bet Clemson a day before, you actually push. You didn't lose that bet. You push. If you bet Texas earlier in the week, you covered comfortably. It was only if you bet Texas, the day of, or maybe the day before, that you were really sweating it, that it came down to that half point difference. So just again, understanding the line movement and that these lines are not static. The one line you hear when you hear things on like ESPN or again social media, you hear that one number, that was never the only number. These lines always move back and forth, and it just depends on when you bet it. That could determine your outcome. So, retail sports books. So, retail sports books are different. They copy their lines from market makers. Now, retail books do have a little bit of leeway in terms of, they don't have to strictly always stick exactly to the number of the market maker that they're copying to, but they can't deviate too far off. Otherwise, they'll expose themselves to essentially what we call arbitrage betting, where they can be taken advantage of effectively. And so they have to copy their lines from the market makers. And the reason that's so important is that when you see these folks talk about, oh, all this money is on team A, it's because they can't move that line because they can't deviate from the market makers who are actually doing price discovery. Retail sports books do not do price discovery. The other biggest thing, retail sports books only want losing bettors. And I know that may be hard to hear, but it's true, right? They only want your business because over the long run, you're going to lose money, as all amateur bettors do. And so if you are actually winning money, again, over the long run, right? I'm talking over a course of hundreds to thousands of bets, they're going to kick you out. And they can't legally kick you out, i.e., ban you that you can't bet there. But what they do is they limit you. And so again, remember earlier I said that market maker books, they don't limit any one individual person. No matter who you are, you can bet whatever game you want up to their general limits, right? But on these retail books, and this is a screenshot from our account at DraftKings, you can see here that for college football, we've been limited, so we can only bet $81.04, right? So that's their way of saying, well, no, we still allow you to play, but because you win too much, because you show tendencies of a sharp better, we're not gonna let you take our money. We're gonna, limit how much you can actually make off of us. And this is a very, very common thing. And the reality is, I said earlier, this happens to winning bettors over the course of a long time. It can happen fairly quickly too. It doesn't have to take hundreds or thousands of bets. It can happen in a couple of bets, couple of dozen of bets. It just depends on some other factors we'll talk about later on about, are you being profiled as someone who can be a long-term winner? So now I just said limits are normally much lower than market makers, right? And they limit these people both as a general rule and individually. But what about, like, again, the Dave Portnoy? You may see these headlines where he had $1 million on Michigan over Alabama. Well, I thought you just said they limit them. How come Dave Portnoy can bet $1 million? Well, in these cases, they do allow for special occasions, right? They do allow for certain case by case bets to go through. And you think about it, this is a great marketing opportunity for these retail sports books, right? They're not going to let someone who they think can be a winner bet $1 million. There's not a chance in hell, right? You know, Dave Portnoy, Mattress Mag, all these kind of celebrity bettors, they know that they don't have an edge. They know over the long run they're going to lose more than they win. So they welcome these kind of bets, even though individually it's a liability. So what happens though is they use this and they promote it, right? They say, "Oh, look, you can be rich and famous. Sports betting is so easy. Everyone thought New Michigan was actually going to beat Alabama, whatever you want to call it." And they use it as marketing. But if you actually went in and you were someone who were a little bit sharp, they would limit you almost immediately. Okay, and then the last thing here is the handles and betting splits that you see. So again, you may have seen these things where so and so much, this much money is on Notre Dame to win, but these many bets are on Ohio State, blah blah blah. These are called betting splits or betting percentages, and what they try to get you to think is, well, see, this is public versus the sharps, right? This is where all the money's on. A lot of the money's on one team. That's probably where the sharp money's at. Or if you see this lopsided handle, the public's all over this, which means the sharp must be on the other side. That's not true. And the reason none of this actually matters in real life is the only time you get percent handle and percent bet splits are from retail sports books. And by what I said earlier, these are only recreational bettors. All the sharp bettors have been kicked out. So none of this actually matters. Doesn't tell you anything about sharp action. We'll talk in a later lecture about things like reverse line movement and trap lines and what people try to connect dots that aren't there and why those things really aren't true. But for now, just understand that when you see these kind of betting splits and a narrative behind that, and it's pros versus Joes, that's just not true because you're only getting one piece of the picture. You actually don't know what the actual handle or amount of money bet at the market makers, i.e., where the sharps bet, because the market making books don't release that data. And like I mentioned earlier, right? It's not just one number. When we talk about the spread, you see here in this example, it says, oh, 56% of the handle was on Ohio State minus 8.5. And that's where 48% of the bets were. But remember, I told you the lines are constantly moving. So even in this example, let's say the Sharps were on, Ohio State, they could have been them at 7.5, 8.5, 9.5. Like you don't know what exact number that those bets actually came in. One, because they were never released, but two, even if they were, you're getting this snapshot of just this one number, in this one number at this one point in time. So for now, just understand that these numbers completely meaningless. They're good for social media, but they don't actually tell you anything. Okay, so given all of this, what can you do today to start winning more bets? And I'll stick with football because that's a big part of what we do here at BTB Analytics. And this is probably the easiest one to make an adjustment. If you're betting football, bet when the lines open the week before. So if you're betting college football, you should be betting on Sunday. The lines come up like Sunday morning or early Sunday afternoon, depending if you're on the East Coast versus West Coast. And then for NFL, the lines open up on Sunday night, and then they kind of continue during the week, for the teams that play for Sunday night football and Monday night football. And so the reason I bring this up is for two reasons. One, again, the lines are softer. And so when these lines first open up, these are the best lines you're going to possibly get. And there's this thing called the efficient market hypothesis. And essentially, all it means is that the crowd, the wisdom of all the community is smarter than any one person, right? And so when these lines open up, they're effectively just one person's opinion, right? And as all these sharps come in, and they start betting it and start moving the line, it's going to get sharper and sharper, i.e., harder to beat over the long run the longer you wait. So if you're waiting until Sunday morning or Saturday morning to bet football, you're completely doing it wrong. You're making it unnecessarily hard on yourself. If you start betting on Sunday, maybe Monday, I guarantee you're going to have a lot easier of a time trying to find good lines for you to bet and for you to win, right? And other thing this allows you to do is it allows you to track what's called closing line value. And so what closing line value is do the lines that you bet on agree with you? So for instance, let's say that again we bet on Ohio State minus 28 against Central Michigan, right? Let's say you bet that on Sunday morning, right? If by Saturday the line's Ohio State minus 31 and a half, then you got closing line value. That line moved in your favor. Or a better way to think about that is you got a line or you got a bet that no longer exists today and it's better than the one that currently exists, right? So if you're seeing that kind of closing line value, that tells you like, hey, you were right. You were actually you're handicapping whatever you're doing to get to the idea that this is a good bet. The sharp betting community agreed with you, and that's a good sign. Doesn't mean you're going to win a bet, but over the long run, you're likely to win more bets than you lose, right? And it allows you to say, hey, maybe sometimes you're just going to lose. I mean, that's sports betting. You just lose bets sometimes. If you are getting good closing line value, but you're losing bets, that lets you know you're still on the right track. You're just kind of in a sports betting rut, which happens to literally everybody, sharp or not, right? Versus if you are losing bets and you're not getting closing line value, right? Or we call negative closing line value. So the line moves against you. So let's say you bet or minus 28, and then come kickoff, it's minus 25, right? That's negative closing line value. If you're losing bets and getting negative closing line value, then your approach is wrong. You need to stop betting and reevaluate how you're determining what's a good bet and what's not. So it does you two things. It gives you a little bit of a better chance to win bets, and it also gives you really good information on your thought process when it comes to making your bets. So with that being said, that's the end of this lecture. On the next lecture, we're going to talk about the simple math that sports books really don't want you to learn. We're going to talk about your break even percentage, implied probability, and the hold. These are all things that Vegas and the sports books use to actually make their money. So when you hear people say sports betting is rigged, it's not rigged because there's some Buffalo Wild Wings that was easy button or anything like that. It's rigged in a much more efficient and effective way, and they don't want you to know this. So if you like this kind of content, please let us know by liking and subscribing. If you have questions about this or anything else, please feel free to drop a comment. We'll be happy to answer them and make videos about those. And as always, good luck.